There comes a time at pretty much every NATO summit where all participants have become thoroughly confused and exasperated after having listened to all the minnows and the Americans that they don't understand. And at that stage, the British representative stands up and put all minds to ease with his eloquence and cutting-edge analysis. And filling that role today, Professor Paul Cornish. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I also begin by saying that this is also my first time at the Leangkollen Conference. I'd like to thank the organisers enormously for inviting me. I'd also like to begin by returning Osler's compliment. I think that's what it was meant to be at the beginning. By saying that when I was teaching at Cambridge, Osler was without doubt the most brilliant Norwegian student that I taught. It matters little that I only taught one Norwegian student. And it matters little that it was only Cambridge, after all. But, can I just begin by saying I think it's very difficult to know at this stage, and this is blindingly obvious, how the UK's engagement with Europe and the world is going to change over the next 4 to 8 years. We are just beginning. The Brexit process has yet to begin formally. And on both the pro and the anti sides in the UK, the terms of negotiation are at the very best contested and unformed, I'd argue, and at the very worst, they're actually considered irrelevant. If you voted out, there's nothing more to be said. Let's just get out. If you voted remain, then there's still a fairly solid campaign to try and reverse the entire decision. So the very idea that there could be a rational basis for negotiation is anathema. So we're in a pretty poor situation in the UK as far as the debate is concerned, I would argue. Nobody has a clear idea where this will all conclude, and I'd also say there are some in Europe, some of our friends now as in Europe, who don't have a very good idea either. We're still hearing voices, we hear some voices calling for a mature and, if you like, an amicable divorce, while there are still others who are pushing, it seems, for the absurd idea that the UK and its democratic electorate should be punished in some way. Punished, and that's the word we're hearing, punished, for the decision taken in June 2016. Quite absurd. On a bit, the UK Prime Minister's meeting with the US President was trumpeted as his first with another national leader. And, you know, we've seen this every year, every 4 years, this desperate and rather unseemly rush to be the first person to meet the new president. It did actually, I think, show something quite clever, that, if I've read it correctly, that wonderful outflanking movement by Theresa May when she more or less got President Trump to agree that NATO was useful in front of everybody, and that seemed to me to be quite a good outcome. But it also resulted in the spectacle of Theresa May holding hands with a man who was subsequently excluded from the Palace of Westminster by the House of Commons Speaker John Bercow, because Bercow considers the US president to be both racist and sexist. So we don't really know whether we're happy with the Prime Minister's relationship with Trump or unhappy at the moment. Who is President Trump? What is his international outlook? What is his strategic vision? Everybody's talking about this in our country just as they are in all of the countries represented here. Well, we don't know. I'd almost reduce it to this. What we do know, the only thing we do know for sure, is that he is the commander-in-chief of the biggest and most important ally, I would guess, for almost all of the countries represented in this room. And that, I think, is probably where we have to begin. But let's just bear in mind, we're only 3 weeks into it, but we haven't yet had a major international security crisis in or involving the US. So let's all keep our fingers crossed. There do seem to me to be some more solid truths as far as the UK's position is concerned, or at least some operating assumptions. The first is that the UK has been, it is, and it will remain internationally engaged, culturally, economically and strategically. That's clear to me. Second is that the UK has an historically, temperamentally and culturally very close relationship and alliance with the US. In the UK, we'd like to think of that relationship as being almost codependent. They really couldn't manage without us. Third is that the UK is a European power, and that most EU members, the vast majority of EU members, let's not forget this, are UK allies. UK allies. And the fourth point I'd mention is that the UK defence budget is in deep trouble again. And that underpins everything I'm about to say. So a bit more detail on these drivers and assumptions. The first is what we're calling in the UK the full spectrum approach. multifunctional cross-governmental responses to complex security challenges. The MOD is very, very closely involved in this, involved in the realization essentially that conflicts and their resolution probably will at some point require some sort of a military involvement, but that military involvement, while necessary, will probably not be sufficient. So the only way we're going to deal with these things is in a mature and a sensible cross-governmental way. Some see the full spectrum approach as simply rebranding. It was, after all, previously known as the comprehensive approach, and then that lost credibility, so we replaced it with a new expression, the integrated approach, and now we're on the full spectrum approach. So it's all very clear. Others see it as the UK's version of Russia's new generation warfare. This is the way we're going to answer the Russians. But I think the full spectrum approach is really is more than all of this. I think if you pick up one expression that comes out of the MOD, the Ministry of Defence at least, if not out of the Foreign Office, it's this idea of persistent engagement. The UK will be engaged persistently and solidly and constantly in regions of interest and instability. And I would argue that in principle, that approach could fit very well with what I've described in the past as the EU's very interdisciplinary CSDP-based strategic culture. The second point I'd mention is what we are calling international by design. Most recently, the National Security Strategy and the Strategic Defence and Security Review of 2015 insisted that UK defence policy and plans should be made international by design. The Secretary of State, Sir Michael Fallon, has argued that IBD reflects what he called the quality of how we operate. And he observed that in a world with global problems, we require multinational solutions, obvious. And he actually believes that IBD is going to be more, not less important after the June 2016 referendum. So there you have another driver. And to a considerable extent, I think that international by design, although it tells us nothing in a sense about the merits of alliance and cooperation that we didn't already know, there are some serious and rather insightful aspects to it. Not least that behind all of it, there's a sense that we, as I said earlier, we cannot pursue national solutions to vastly complicated international strategic problems. So in short, in the UK view, international by design, it embodies two ideas. The first is that it provides a force multiplier for UK's strategic and operational capability. Bear in mind that we are in a period of defence deficit, if you like. So the involvement through IBD is a way of multiplying our effort, but also for the UK to be a force facilitator for a much larger effort, and I'll come back to this later. And underpinning both of these ideas, as I've been saying, is the idea that, or the notion that international by design should achieve efficiency. So what about efficiency? Current MOD thinking is that efficiency can and must be both cost reductive, which is a very familiar ambition. We've all heard about this, and I guess lots of people in this room have been doing it for decades. But not just cost reductive, also value additive. In other words, not only a demand to do the same or often more with less, but also to employ methods and means more imaginatively to do more but differently. And now, if the language of efficiency, so both cost reductive on the one hand and value additive on the other, and international effectiveness, if these are to be more than just declaratory, and if they're to be more than just another MOD rebranding exercise, then clearly the UK has to bring something solid and tangible to the negotiation table, if you like. So what does it offer? Well, what does the UK offer that might persuade allies and potential international partners to participate in this UK vision? Well, most obviously, the UK can offer hard power in the form of maritime, land and air forces. Certainly, these don't come in anything like the quantities seen a decade or two ago, but I think even the harshest critic would have to accept that UK armed forces are highly experienced and capable. They can operate across the spectrum of conflict and at some range, and that these forces are deployable within and around Europe. And then there are also standing tasks to bear in mind, such as the nuclear deterrent and air patrolling and all these other things. The UK can also offer other less tangible but no less significant strategic capabilities, such as intelligence coverage and cyber power. And then there's a set of specialist skills that the UK offers in the context of Brexit. I think there's an obvious irony at play here. The UK has been more than gently disparaging of EU defence efforts over the past several decades. And I would argue that often not without reason, Traditionally, the UK has always insisted that whatever the EU pursues in the politico-military sphere, that the results must not duplicate the broader NATO-based transatlantic security relationship. All of that is quite familiar, but attitudes in the UK have been changing quite considerably in the last, well, very recently, although you could say that actually this change began as long ago as 1996, I guess it was, with the Berlin Plus, that whole movement, actually, that Consensus was touching upon. The point is that the UK is now much more willing to see NATO as something of a holding company, allowing the development of clubs within clubs, if you like. Clubs such as the Northern Group, and such as the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force, the UK-France Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, and so on. But my point is this, that the UK now finds itself, I think, in the unexpected position of being able to offer skills and capabilities to its European allies in the context of Brexit. In other words, some of the capabilities that the UK has always insisted were the core of the primary defence effort in or around NATO are now seen, I won't push this too far, but they're now seen in a way as levers to be pulled in the context of Brexit. This isn't to say that defence is being trivialised by the Brexit pre-negotiations, but it is that the UK realises that it's got important capabilities that its European allies want and need. So I mentioned intelligence. That's the first and the most obvious of these. Europe needs British intelligence. I wish I'd read this before I read it. Intelligence, both in terms of the capability of its national agencies, MI5, MI6, GCHQ, Defence Intelligence, so on, and in terms of its bilateral and global connections, so the UK-US connection, the Five Eyes, and so on. But the UK also brings other specialist skills and experience acquired in this quarter of a century or more of almost constant operational commitment, and indeed in this climate of austerity-led defence planning. I'll just go through those very quickly and then I'll finish. So command and control. We think we've got something to offer our European allies. Then there's dynamic force management, to use UK MOD jargon. So this is managing training and operations and deployments all sort of at the same time, being able to roll troops and forces around, to be able to mass forces and then disperse them rapidly and redeploy them. The design and development and the review of military doctrine in the UK MOD's think tank, the DCDC. Strategic and operational planning, the evolution of procurement practices, including the role of the involvement of small and medium enterprises. In spite of the defence deficit, there has been a lot of movement in that area over the past years. And the changing relationship between armed forces and society I'd also float as something that we've been thinking about and working on quite intensely for the last 20 years or so. So let me finish by answering the question. I'm going to answer the question in terms of by quoting 3 speeches. Now, don't worry, not the entire speech, just snippets from 3 recent speeches that I'm sure you've all read. And this is a very dull thing to do, but the reason I'm doing this is because this is where it's at in the UK at the moment. I don't think you'll get a better assessment, in a way, of the way the UK government is thinking at the moment. So the first is from the Prime Minister's speech at Lancaster House in mid-January, when she said, among other things, she said this: "With the threats to our common security becoming more serious, our response cannot be to cooperate with one another less, but to work together more. I therefore want our future relationship with the EU to include practical arrangements on matters of law enforcement and the sharing of intelligence material with our allies. We'll continue to work closely with our European allies in foreign and defence policy, even as we leave the EU itself. Britain's armed forces are a crucial part of Europe's collective defence. And finally, after Brexit, Britain wants to be a good friend and neighbour in every way, and that includes defending the safety and security of all of our citizens." When she went to the US, just before she held hands with Donald, she said this in Philadelphia: "It has been America's destiny to bear the leadership of the free world and to carry that heavy responsibility on its shoulders. But my country, the United Kingdom, has been proud to share that burden and to walk alongside you at every stage. As we end our membership of the European Union, we have the opportunity to reassert our belief in a confident, sovereign and global Britain, ready to build relationships with old friends and new allies alike. And finally, it is in our interests, those of Britain and America together, to stand strong together to defend our values, our interests and the very ideas in which we believe." And the final comment is from Sir Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary's speech just a week or so ago, 10 days ago, in Scotland, when he said this: Russia is clearly testing NATO and the West. It is seeking to expand its sphere of influence, destabilize countries, and weaken the alliance. It is undermining national security for many allies and the international rule-based system. Therefore, it is in our interest and Europe's to keep NATO strong and to deter and dissuade Russia from this course. So, in summary, 4 very quick points, Osler. The broad UK view is business as usual. And this is partly in desperation, desperation promoted by all the uncertainties we're experiencing over Brexit and Trump. We simply have to hold the course, I think, until things settle, and indeed by the financial outlook. We can't afford to do everything we might want to do. Partly all of that, but partly the result of very reasoned analysis, I think. Second point is that the UK is going to continue to see itself as a bridge between the US and Europe, and it thinks it has things to offer on both sides of that bridge. Third is that we should expect the UK to offer more to its European allies over the coming year or so, but to expect more in return. And that's where we come back to the entire 2% commitment debate. And my final point is that, having said business as usual, Russia is not business as usual. And that's essentially what Fallon was saying. Thank you.
Excellent. I saw the pens were wiggling furiously throughout your talk. There should be some good questions following upon that.